Randy Whitaker didn't bother lowering his voice. The courthouse hallway was crowded lawyers, clerks, families waiting for their own hearings, yet he spoke as if the room existed only for him. "I'll be keeping the house," he said casually, almost kindly. "You never handled the finances anyway, Rosalie." A few people glanced over. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Rosalie Wentworth stood still beside her attorney, hands folded, expression unreadable. Randy smiled the way men do when they believe the ending is already written. What he didn't remember, what he had completely forgotten, was that the house he demanded so confidently still had a basement. And somewhere behind a wall down there was a document bearing his own signature. A confession he once believed no one else would ever find. Before we continue, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel far, and it's always fascinating to see where quiet truths are being heard. If you believe that dignity, patience, and the truth still matter, even when they move slowly, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's go back to the beginning. Most people who knew Rosalie Wentworth and Randy Whitaker believed they understood their marriage. From the outside, it looked balanced, stable, even quietly successful. Their house stood on a tree-lined street in the northern suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, an older brick property with deep windows and a wide front porch that suggested permanence. Neighbors walked dogs past the yard each evening and often commented on how well the place had been restored. Randy always nodded politely when they praised the renovation. Rosalie would simply smile. To most observers, they appeared to be the kind of couple that had settled comfortably into adulthood. Randy Whitaker carried himself with easy confidence. He worked as a commercial real estate consultant, a profession that rewarded his ability to sound certain, even when negotiating uncertainty. He dressed carefully, spoke smoothly, and knew how to dominate a conversation without appearing aggressive. In meetings, he had a habit of leaning back slightly in his chair, fingers loosely interlocked, as if the outcome of every discussion had already been decided. People liked that about him. It felt like competence. Rosalie Wentworth was different. She worked in archival research for Ohio State University's library system, where patience was more valuable than speed, and silence often revealed more than questions. Her days were spent organizing historical documents, preserving records, and reconstructing timelines from fragments of correspondence or forgotten ledgers. It was work that required precision and restraint, and Rosalie possessed both. She spoke softly, listened carefully, and rarely interrupted anyone. In social settings, she often allowed Randy to lead conversations, while she observed quietly from beside him. Some interpreted this as shyness. Others assumed she simply wasn't interested in the practical matters Randy liked to discuss: finances, markets, property values. Randy never corrected those assumptions. In fact, he often reinforced them. "She hates numbers," he would say lightly when friends asked about investments. "I handle all the financial headaches, so she doesn't have to." The remark always sounded affectionate, protective even. Rosalie would smile politely when he said it, but she never agreed with it out loud. The truth was more complicated. Rosalie didn't dislike numbers. She simply understood that numbers revealed their meaning slowly. Bank statements, receipts, and financial transfers were like archival documents, each piece insignificant alone, but powerful when placed in sequence. And sequences were something Rosalie noticed instinctively. The house they lived in had been purchased 9 years earlier, shortly after Randy's consulting career began to accelerate. It was not new when they bought it. The structure dated back to the late 1960s and had been modified several times over the decades. Some renovations were tasteful, others were less careful. Randy immediately began planning improvements. He liked projects that could be discussed with neighbors and colleagues: new flooring, kitchen upgrades, landscaping. The house slowly transformed under his direction. Contractors came and went during the first few years of their marriage, and Randy handled nearly all communication with them. Rosalie did not interfere. She watched. Over time, the property became a source of quiet pride for Randy. When clients visited the neighborhood, he sometimes drove them past the house. pointing casually toward the porch as if the building itself reflected his professional judgment. But there was one area of the home Randy treated differently from the rest: the basement. It was large compared to many houses on the street, stretching beneath most of the structure in a wide rectangular layout. At first, it had been unfinished concrete floor, exposed insulation, dim overhead lighting. Randy decided it needed renovation. The plan he explained to Rosalie was to convert part of the space into a home office and storage area. He hired a contractor to begin the structural work, but even during the early stages, Randy insisted on handling certain details himself. Late at night, after the contractors had left, he would often go downstairs alone. Sometimes he remained there for hours. Rosalie never followed him, but she noticed patterns. She noticed when new wall panels appeared where none had been installed the day before. She noticed deliveries arriving that didn't always correspond with the contractor's schedule. She noticed Randy locking the basement door occasionally, a habit that seemed unnecessary in their house occupied by only 2 people. She did not confront him about it. Instead, she did what came naturally to someone trained in archival research. She remembered. Rosalie kept notebooks for many aspects of her life: research notes, reading lists, reminders for small household tasks. Writing helped her organize thoughts and reconstruct details later when memories became unclear. At first, the notebooks contained ordinary domestic observations: contractor schedules, paint colors, delivery dates. But gradually, the notes began to include other things. Dates when Randy transferred money between accounts without mentioning it. Conversations that ended abruptly when she asked simple questions about expenses. Invoices that arrived by email with totals slightly higher than the estimates she remembered hearing. None of these details seemed dramatic on their own. In fact, if someone had asked Rosalie directly whether she believed Randy was hiding something, she would not have answered yes. Not yet. What she sensed instead was a pattern forming quietly beneath everyday routines. Small discrepancies repeating themselves often enough that they stopped feeling random. Randy, meanwhile, believed his explanations were working. Whenever Rosalie asked about a transaction or a renovation cost, he answered smoothly. Sometimes the explanation involved contractor delays. Sometimes it involved temporary investment moves he claimed were too technical to explain fully. And when Rosalie didn't argue, Randy interpreted her silence as understanding or indifference. He underestimated the difference. In Randy's mind, Rosalie's calm demeanor meant she preferred to stay outside financial decisions. It fit comfortably with the image he presented to friends, a husband who protected his wife from complicated matters. He liked that narrative. It made him look responsible. Rosalie never tried to correct it. But in the quiet hours after Randy fell asleep, she sometimes sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing account statements line by line. Transfers appeared and disappeared between accounts whose names she didn't always recognize. She saved copies, not because she had decided anything was wrong, simply because records had value. Archival work had taught her that truth rarely announces itself immediately. It accumulates slowly, layer upon layer, until a moment arrives when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Rosalie did not yet know when that moment would come. But she suspected the house, the one Randy spoke about with so much confidence, held more history than anyone outside the marriage could see, especially beneath the floor. Down in the basement, where renovations had taken longer than expected, and where Randy had spent so many evenings alone. Rosalie had learned long ago that the quietest rooms in a building often held the most important records. And houses like archives remembered everything. Even when the people living inside them tried to forget, patterns rarely announce themselves. They gather quietly the way dust gathers on a shelf that no one thinks to wipe for months. At first, nothing seems unusual. Then one day the layer becomes visible, and once seen it cannot be unseen. Rosalie Wentworth noticed the pattern in their finances long before she understood what it meant. It began with numbers that didn't quite stay where they should have. One Tuesday evening, months after the basement renovation had begun, Rosalie sat at the kitchen table reviewing the household account. The habit had started innocently enough, simply making sure bills were paid on time. Randy had never objected to her checking statements because he assumed she wouldn't look closely. That assumption worked in his favor for a while. But Rosalie didn't skim. She read. The first transfer that caught her attention wasn't large. A few $1,000s moved from their joint savings into an account she didn't recognize. The account name appeared abbreviated, something that looked like a contractor's holding account. When Randy came home that night, Rosalie mentioned it casually. Was that for the basement project? Randy barely glanced up from loosening his tie. Yeah, he said. Marcus needed a deposit for materials. Marcus Delaney was the contractor managing the renovation. The explanation made sense. Rosalie nodded and returned to her notes. But a week later, another transfer appeared. Then another. This time, the descriptions were slightly different. Temporary escrow, consulting reserve, project allocation. The numbers varied, but the direction of the money remained consistent out of the joint account and into places Rosalie couldn't fully see. None of it looked illegal, just complicated. Randy always had explanations ready. One evening, he stood in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of bourbon while Rosalie asked about a $7.800 transfer that had appeared earlier that afternoon. Investment float, he said easily. Rosalie tilted her head. For what short-term opportunity? Randy replied, taking a sip. Real estate deal in Cincinnati. It'll circle back. His tone suggested the matter was too routine to deserve further discussion. Rosalie simply nodded. She didn't argue because arguing wouldn't have produced clarity. Instead, she opened her notebook later that night and wrote the date beside the amount. Over the following months, the transfers continued. Some were large enough to notice immediately. Others were subtle enough that many people would have overlooked them entirely. Rosalie didn't overlook them. Her work at the university had trained her to examine records the way historians examine letters, searching for tone as much as content. A single sentence might not reveal much, but when dozens of letters repeated the same phrasing, meaning began to emerge. Money, she realized, behaved the same way. There was also the matter of the invoices. Marcus Delaney's renovation company sent receipts periodically as the basement work progressed. Most arrived through email attachments Randy forwarded without comment. At first glance, the numbers aligned with the transfers Randy described. But Rosalie noticed something odd. Some invoices arrived twice. Not duplicates, exactly, slightly different versions of the same bill. The amounts had been adjusted upward by a few $100s, sometimes by $1,000. The changes were small enough to appear like ordinary contractor revisions. Still, Rosalie saved both versions. Not because she believed Marcus was dishonest, because records mattered. Around that time, another name began appearing occasionally in Randy's conversations. Caleb Monroe. Randy described him as a financial advisor who helped structure investments for several of Randy's consulting clients. Caleb's brilliant with tax positioning. Randy said one night while scrolling through his phone. He finds ways to move money without triggering unnecessary liabilities. Rosalie asked once if they should meet him together. Randy shook his head. Not necessary, he said quickly. He mostly handles the commercial side. Rosalie didn't insist, but she wrote the name down. Months passed. The basement renovation advanced slowly, far slower than the upstairs improvements had. Contractors came and went, yet Randy continued spending late evenings downstairs, even when no scheduled work remained. Sometimes Rosalie heard him on the phone. His voice carried faintly through the floor vents, quiet, tense conversations that stopped the moment footsteps approached the basement door. Rosalie never stood outside that door. Instead, she paid attention to the changes above it. One morning, she walked into the kitchen and found Randy staring at his laptop with unusual intensity. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said quickly, closing the screen halfway. "Just dealing with a transfer issue." "What kind timing problem?" Randy replied. "Nothing serious." Later that day, Rosalie logged into their joint account, and noticed a series of rapid transactions. Funds moving out, then back in, then out again. The amounts were large enough that most people might have panicked. Rosalie didn't panic. She copied the transaction numbers into her notebook. By the end of that year, Rosalie had accumulated an entire section of notes labeled were simply accounts, dates, amounts, descriptions exactly as they appeared on statements. She didn't attach conclusions to them. Conclusions required evidence, and evidence required patience. Randy, meanwhile, grew subtly more protective of his financial explanations. When Rosalie asked neutral questions, he sometimes answered with mild irritation. "You worry too much about details," he told her once while loading the dishwasher. "Finance doesn't work like a library catalog." Rosalie dried a plate slowly before placing it in the cabinet. "Maybe not," she said gently. Randy interpreted her tone as concession. In reality, Rosalie had simply recognized something important. Randy's explanations had started to shift. Early in the renovation, he had spoken confidently about every transaction. Now his answers were shorter, more defensive. He also began using language that sounded oddly legal: asset positioning, liquidity exposure, strategic timing. These were phrases Rosalie rarely heard in normal household conversations. But she wrote them down anyway, because words like numbers formed patterns. One evening in early autumn, Rosalie sat at the dining table reviewing her notes when Randy entered the room carrying a folder. He hesitated slightly when he saw her laptop open. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Just organizing bills," Rosalie said calmly. Randy placed the folder on the counter but didn't open it. Sometimes you dig too deeply into things, he said. Rosalie looked up. The statement was delivered casually, yet there was an undercurrent beneath it. Concern, or perhaps caution. Rosalie closed her notebook. "Habit from work," she replied. "Archivists collect details." Randy smiled faintly. "Well," he said, "not every detail matters." Rosalie nodded. But she knew something Randy did not. In archives, the details that seem least important are often the ones historians return to years later, because they reveal the moments when a story quietly began to change. And the story of Randy Whitaker's finances was beginning to shift in ways he hadn't fully considered. He believed Rosalie's calm meant she wasn't watching. He believed her silence meant she trusted him. What Randy didn't understand was that Rosalie's silence was something else entirely. It was observation. And observation, when paired with time, had a way of becoming evidence. The numbers kept moving. The invoices kept arriving. And beneath the house in a basement Randy believed belonged entirely to him, something else waited quietly. Something he had once written down with his own hand. Something Rosalie had not forgotten, not even for a moment. 5 years before the courthouse hallway, before lawyers and filings, and the quiet weight of legal language entered their lives, the basement renovation had seemed like nothing more than another home project. At least that was how Randy Whitaker presented it. "Think of it as an investment," he told Rosalie one Saturday morning while standing at the top of the basement stairs. Dust floated through the air from the exposed concrete floor below. Extra office space adds resale value. Rosalie stood beside him, looking down into the unfinished room. The basement stretched wider than the footprint of most houses in the neighborhood. Bare support beams divided the space into uneven sections, and a single fluorescent light buzzed faintly near the center of the ceiling. It wasn't an unpleasant room, just incomplete. "Do you really need a full office down there?" Rosalie asked gently. Randy shrugged. "Consulting work is growing. Sometimes I need privacy for calls." That explanation sounded reasonable. Randy's work involved negotiations, contracts, investment discussions. Privacy would be expected. Rosalie nodded and returned upstairs. Within 2 weeks, Randy had hired a contractor. His name was Marcus Delaney, a quiet man in his early 40s who owned a small renovation company that worked mostly on older suburban houses. Marcus arrived with 2 employees' tool cases and a stack of architectural sketches rolled under his arm. The renovation plan was straightforward. Reinforce several support beams, install drywall and insulation along the foundation walls, add recessed lighting, build a small office area with built-in shelving. Marcus walked Rosalie through the outline on the first day while Randy took a phone call outside. "Nothing unusual here," Marcus said, pointing to the diagrams. "Just modernizing the space." Rosalie thanked him politely. But even in those early days, she noticed something. Randy stayed unusually involved in the renovation. Most homeowners checked on projects once or twice a day. Randy visited the basement every hour. He asked Marcus questions about measurements, insulation placement, wiring routes. Sometimes he brought his laptop downstairs and remained there while the crew worked. Marcus didn't seem bothered. He was used to clients taking interest. Still, there were moments when Randy's attention felt less like curiosity and more like control. One afternoon, Rosalie came downstairs with a tray of coffee cups for the workers. Marcus and his crew were installing wall frames along the far side of the basement. Randy stood near them, studying the unfinished structure. When Marcus mentioned a small design change near one of the corners, Randy shook his head immediately. "No," he said. "Leave that section open for now." Marcus glanced at the blueprint. "We had drywall scheduled there," he replied. "I'll handle it later," Randy said. His tone was polite but firm. Marcus shrugged and moved on to the next section. Rosalie said nothing. But she noticed the location Randy had pointed to, a narrow space along the north wall. Over the next several weeks, the renovation progressed steadily. Drywall panels covered the concrete foundation. Wiring disappeared into insulated channels, and the fluorescent lighting was replaced with recessed fixtures that cast warmer light across the room. Marcus's crew completed most of the work by early evening each day. After they left, Randy often remained downstairs. At first, Rosalie assumed he was simply inspecting the progress. But gradually the hours stretched longer. 9 o'clock, 10, sometimes nearly midnight. When Rosalie asked if the project was running behind schedule, Randy waved the concern away. "Just organizing things," he said. "What things? Files, equipment." Rosalie accepted the answer without pressing further. One evening, however, something unusual happened. The contractors had finished installing insulation that afternoon. Marcus planned to return the following day to seal the walls and begin painting. Rosalie was reading in the living room around 11 when she heard movement downstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like furniture sliding against concrete. She paused, listening. Then came Randy's voice. Soft at first, muffled through the floorboards. Rosalie assumed he was on a phone call. But after a few minutes, she realized something was different. Randy wasn't speaking in the rhythm of conversation. There were pauses, then sentences, then another pause. It sounded like someone recording a message. Rosalie closed her book slowly. She didn't move toward the basement door. Instead, she listened. The words were indistinct through the ceiling, but she could hear the tone clearly enough. Randy sounded frustrated, even agitated. After several minutes, the sound stopped. A chair scraped across the floor. Then silence. Randy came upstairs shortly afterward, carrying a folder. He seemed calmer when he entered the kitchen. "Late night," he said casually, setting the folder on the counter. Rosalie nodded. "Did the contractors leave tools down there?" she asked. "Just cleaning up some paperwork," Randy replied. He poured himself a glass of water and changed the subject. Rosalie didn't mention what she had heard. The next morning, Marcus returned with his crew. They began sealing the insulation along the north wall, the same section Randy had insisted remain open earlier. Rosalie watched for a moment while they worked. Then something caught her attention. The insulation panel Marcus installed didn't sit flush with the surrounding wall. There was a small recessed space behind it, perhaps a few inches deep. "Will that be covered later?" Rosalie asked casually. Marcus wiped dust from his hands. "Yeah," he said. "Your husband said he'd handle the finishing panel himself." Rosalie nodded. That evening, Randy indeed installed the final wall panel personally. He worked carefully using tools Marcus had left behind. Rosalie watched from the stairs for a few minutes. Randy didn't notice her. Before sealing the panel completely, he slid something into the recessed space behind the insulation. A thin envelope. Then he placed the wall panel over it and secured the screws. The process took less than 10 minutes. When he turned and saw Rosalie standing on the stairs, he smiled. "Just finishing Marcus's work," he said. Rosalie smiled back. But she remembered exactly where the panel was located. North wall, second support beam from the corner. Later that week, the basement renovation was officially completed. The space looked impressive. Clean drywall, recessed lighting, a small office desk near the far wall. Randy seemed pleased with the results. He even invited a few colleagues over one weekend to show them the transformation. Rosalie stood quietly near the staircase while Randy explained the improvements. Everyone admired the room. No one questioned the smooth new wall panels, and certainly no one imagined that behind one of them, sealed carefully behind insulation and drywall, sat a thin envelope Randy Whitaker had placed there himself. Inside it was a document he had recorded and signed late at night when he believed he was alone. At the time, Rosalie didn't know exactly what the paper contained, but she remembered the moment clearly. The sound of his voice speaking to an unseen recorder, the careful way he slid the envelope behind the wall, and the quiet satisfaction in his expression afterward. Randy believed the basement was the safest place in the house. What he never realized was that Rosalie Wentworth's memory worked very much like the archives she tended at the university. Nothing placed in storage was ever truly forgotten, especially not when it had been signed, especially not when it had been hidden. The divorce did not begin with shouting. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic accusations thrown across the kitchen table. When the end of Rosalie Wentworth's marriage arrived, it arrived in the quiet language of paperwork. A large white envelope appeared in the mailbox on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Rosalie recognized the return address immediately, Whitaker and Pierce Legal Services. For a moment, she simply held the envelope in her hands, feeling the thickness of the documents inside. The air outside carried the faint smell of wet leaves, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower hummed steadily. Ordinary sounds, ordinary weather. Nothing about the afternoon suggested the life she'd been living for 9 years was about to be reorganized by legal procedure. Inside the envelope were several pages. The first was a petition for dissolution of marriage filed in the Franklin County Domestic Relations Court. Petitioner Randy Whitaker. Respondent Rosalie Wentworth Whitaker. Rosalie read the document slowly at the kitchen table. The language was polite, almost clinical. The marriage, it explained, had broken down beyond repair. The parties would seek equitable distribution of assets and liabilities. Both individuals were encouraged to cooperate during the process. There were no emotional descriptions, just requests. One request appeared repeatedly: the marital residence. Randy's petition included a preliminary proposal stating that the house should remain under his ownership because he had primarily managed the property's financial obligations and improvement investments. Rosalie read that sentence twice. Then she turned the page. The rest of the petition described Randy's income consulting work and financial responsibilities in careful detail. Rosalie's profession appeared briefly near the bottom of one paragraph. Archivist, Ohio State University Library System. Her salary was listed. Her role in financial decision-making was described more vaguely. Rosalie placed the papers back into the envelope and folded her hands on the table. The house. Even before the formal hearings began, Randy was already positioning himself to keep it. Later that evening, Randy returned home slightly earlier than usual. He walked into the kitchen carrying his laptop bag and paused when he saw the envelope on the table. So he said calmly, loosening his tie, "You got the paperwork." Rosalie nodded. "Yes." Randy set his bag down and leaned against the counter. "I didn't want things to get complicated," he said. "Filing early keeps the process clean." Rosalie looked at him quietly. Clean, she repeated. Randy mistook her tone for agreement. The lawyers will handle most of it, he continued. We'll divide assets, settle the house situation, move forward. Rosalie did not ask him why he had chosen this moment to end the marriage. Not because she lacked curiosity, but because she had already noticed something important. The house had been mentioned 3 times in the petition, more than any other asset. Randy poured himself a glass of water. I assume you'll hire counsel, he said. Yes, Rosalie replied. Good, Randy said. That keeps things professional. The conversation ended there. Neither of them raised their voices. Neither accused the other of betrayal or neglect. From the outside, the separation might have looked remarkably civilized. But Rosalie understood something that Randy did not. Divorce, like archival research, was fundamentally about records. And Randy had already begun writing his version of those records. 2 days later, Rosalie met with an attorney recommended by a colleague at the university. Her office was located downtown in a modest brick building not far from the courthouse. Her name was Naomi Caldwell. Naomi was in her late 40s with steady eyes and a habit of listening without interruption. Her office shelves held thick legal binders arranged with the same meticulous order Rosalie used in the archives. When Rosalie finished explaining the situation, Naomi leaned back in her chair. Your husband filed quickly, she said. Yes. Has he mentioned why? No. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. That's not unusual, she said. But the speed suggests he has a plan. Rosalie placed a folder on Naomi's desk. Inside were printed bank statements, renovation invoices, and several pages of notes written in Rosalie's precise handwriting. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You've been documenting finances for a while, Rosalie said. Naomi flipped through the pages slowly. Dates, transaction amounts, annotations beside several entries. You organized this yourself? Naomi asked. Yes. Naomi closed the folder and studied Rosalie carefully. Most people come in with emotional stories, she said. You came with records. Rosalie didn't answer. Naomi smiled faintly. That's not a criticism, she said. It's actually helpful. She turned to the divorce petition and tapped one paragraph lightly. Your husband is pushing hard for the house. Rosalie nodded. Yes. Do you know why it matters so much to him? Rosalie hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke. There may be something in the basement. Naomi waited. Rosalie described the renovation from 5 years earlier. The contractors, the unfinished wall section, the envelope Randy had hidden behind the panel. Naomi listened without interrupting. When Rosalie finished, Naomi folded her hands. Did you ever see the contents of the envelope? No, but you're certain it exists? Yes. Naomi leaned back in her chair again. That could matter, she said. Rosalie said nothing. Naomi continued. Your husband's petition suggests he handled most financial matters, she explained. If there are undisclosed assets or misleading statements tied to the property, the house becomes very relevant. Rosalie looked down at the folder. I don't know exactly what he hid, she said. You don't have to, Naomi replied calmly. What matters is that you remember where it is. For the first time since the meeting began, Rosalie felt the faintest shift in the room. Not relief, not triumph, just clarity. Naomi reached for a legal pad and began writing. The next step is discovery, she said. We request financial disclosures, communication records, renovation contracts, everything. And the house, Rosalie asked. Naomi looked up. If your husband is pushing aggressively for it this early, she said slowly, that tells me something important. But Naomi's pen stopped moving. He believes the house protects him. Rosalie considered that. Yes, that sounded like Randy. Confident, strategic, certain he understood the structure of the story better than anyone else. Naomi closed the folder. We'll move carefully, she said. No accusations until the records support them. Rosalie nodded. Careful was something she understood. Outside Naomi's office, the city moved through its normal rhythms. Traffic lights, changing pedestrians, crossing streets, lawyers walking toward the courthouse with briefcases in hand. The divorce had begun. Randy Whitaker believed he was guiding the process toward an outcome he had already planned. But he had forgotten something. Records had a way of resurfacing. And sometimes the most important records were the ones hidden behind walls, especially when they were signed. The first mediation session took place 6 weeks after Randy Whitaker filed the divorce petition. By then, the legal machinery had already begun to move in quiet, methodical increments. Financial disclosures had been requested. Preliminary documents had been exchanged. The process unfolded not through dramatic confrontations, but through stacks of paperwork that traveled between offices downtown. Rosalie Wentworth approached it the same way she approached archival work, carefully, patiently. On the morning of mediation, the sky over Columbus was pale and overcast. The meeting took place in a neutral office suite near the courthouse, a room designed to keep conflict contained within polite boundaries. The mediator introduced himself as Ethan Keller. He was a middle-aged man with a measured voice and the practiced calm of someone accustomed to watching difficult conversations unfold across conference tables. The room itself was simple. A rectangular table, several leather chairs, a pitcher of water, and notepads placed at each seat. Randy Whitaker arrived first. He wore a navy suit and carried a thin folder under his arm. His posture suggested confidence, as if the meeting were a business negotiation he had already rehearsed. A few minutes later, Rosalie entered with her attorney, Naomi Caldwell. Rosalie wore a dark gray coat and carried a small notebook in her hand. She took her seat quietly. Ethan Keller began the session with standard instructions. Mediation works best when both parties focus on practical solutions, he said. The goal is to resolve issues without unnecessary litigation. Randy nodded immediately. That's exactly what I want, he said. His tone sounded cooperative, almost generous. Naomi Caldwell didn't respond. She simply folded her hands and waited. Ethan glanced at the documents on the table. The primary issues appear to involve property division and the marital residence, he said. Randy leaned forward slightly. Yes, he said. The house should remain with me. His voice carried a note of certainty that made the statement sound less like a proposal and more like a conclusion. Rosalie did not look at him. Instead, she opened her notebook and placed her pen on the page. Ethan Keller turned toward Randy. Can you explain your reasoning? Randy seemed pleased to elaborate. I've handled the financial responsibilities for the property since we purchased it, he said. Mortgage payments, renovation investments, property taxes. He gestured lightly toward Rosalie. Rosalie has never really been involved in those details. The remark was delivered politely, but it carried an unmistakable implication. Rosalie was quiet, uninformed, perhaps even incapable of managing something as complicated as property ownership. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. And Rosalie? He said, how do you view the house? Rosalie lifted her eyes from the notebook. Her voice remained soft. It's the home we built together. Randy gave a faint smile. Emotionally sure, he said. But legally and financially, I've been the one maintaining it. The room grew slightly quieter. Naomi Caldwell watched Randy with an expression that revealed very little. Ethan turned to Rosalie again. Do you disagree with your husband's description of the financial arrangements? Rosalie paused. Then she answered carefully. I believe the records will clarify that. Randy exhaled through his nose as if amused. Rosalie, he said lightly, this isn't about records. It's about practicality. He leaned back in his chair. You've always avoided dealing with finances. That's fine. But the house requires someone who understands those responsibilities. The statement hung in the air. Not aggressive, just dismissive. Rosalie wrote a single line in her notebook. Naomi noticed. Randy continued speaking. Look, he said, spreading his hand slightly. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'll take the house, assume the remaining mortgage, and compensate Rosalie fairly for her share. Ethan nodded slowly. That's one possible structure, he said. Rosalie closed her notebook gently. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked directly at Randy. "You want the house quickly," she said. It was not a question. Randy shrugged. "Efficiency is good for everyone." Naomi Caldwell finally spoke. "Why the urgency?" Randy glanced at her. "Because dragging things out wastes money." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes thoroughness saves it." Randy smiled, only when there's something to find. For a moment, the room fell silent. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Let's focus on constructive solutions," he said. Randy nodded again, returning to his composed demeanor. "My proposal is simple," he continued. "I keep the house. Rosalie receives an equitable financial settlement, and we both move on." He looked toward Rosalie as he said the final words. "Move on." Rosalie studied him quietly. In that moment, Randy Whittaker appeared exactly as he had throughout most of their marriage, confident, persuasive, certain that the narrative unfolding in the room belonged to him. What he didn't notice was Naomi Caldwell watching him with growing interest. Because people who push too hard for something early in negotiations often reveal more than they intend. Naomi had seen that pattern many times before. Randy's insistence on the house was not merely strategic. It was urgent. And urgency always had a reason. The mediation session continued for another hour. They discussed bank accounts, retirement funds, vehicles. Randy answered questions smoothly, presenting financial details with the ease of someone accustomed to managing complex transactions. Rosalie spoke rarely. When she did, her answers were precise and short. At one point, Randy turned toward her again. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. Rosalie didn't reply. Instead, she wrote another line in her notebook. Naomi glanced at the page briefly. Dates. 2 short words. North Wall. Ethan eventually called a pause in the discussion. "I think we need additional documentation before we finalize anything," he said. Randy's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "What kind of documentation?" "Financial records, renovation expenses," Ethan replied. "Standard review." Randy forced a polite smile. "Of course." But Naomi saw the change in his posture. Just for a moment, Randy Whittaker looked less certain than he had when the meeting began. The mediation ended without resolution. Outside the office building, the afternoon sky had grown darker. Randy walked toward the parking lot without speaking. Rosalie stood beside Naomi on the sidewalk. "You wrote something during the meeting," Naomi said quietly. "Yes." Naomi looked at her. What was it? Rosalie closed the notebook. A reminder of what Rosalie's voice remained calm. That Randy wants the house faster than the rest of the divorce. Naomi nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "And when someone wants something that quickly," Rosalie continued, "it usually means they're worried about losing control of it." Naomi allowed herself a small smile. "That's exactly what I was thinking." Across the street, Randy Whittaker unlocked his car and climbed inside. He still believed the process was moving in the direction he had planned. What he didn't realize was that his urgency had already revealed something important. The house was not just property to him. It was protection. And the more determined he appeared to claim it, the clearer one truth became. Whatever he believed was hidden inside that house, he was afraid someone might eventually find it. After the mediation session, the pace of the divorce changed. Until that point, Randy Whittaker had controlled most of the narrative. He had filed first, proposed the terms, and spoken confidently about the direction the process should take. In the language of negotiation, he had tried to establish the frame. But mediation had revealed something Naomi Caldwell understood immediately. Randy wanted the house too quickly, and urgency in legal disputes often pointed toward vulnerability. The following week, Naomi scheduled another meeting with Rosalie in her downtown office. Rosalie arrived with the same quiet folder she had brought before, though the stack of documents inside had grown thicker. Naomi closed the door and gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Let's talk about the basement," she said. Rosalie nodded. She had expected the question. Start from the beginning, Naomi continued. Not just the night you heard him recording. I want the entire timeline. Rosalie placed her notebook on the desk and opened it carefully. I remember when the renovation started, she said. 5 years ago, early spring. Naomi began writing. Contractor Marcus Delaney. Rosalie explained how Randy had hired Marcus to renovate the basement office space. She described the workers arriving, the materials being delivered, the gradual transformation of the unfinished concrete room. Naomi listened closely. Did Marcus finish the entire job? Most of it, Rosalie replied. But Randy insisted on completing one wall section himself. Naomi looked up. Which wall? The north wall. Rosalie drew a small diagram in her notebook and slid it across the desk. Naomi studied it. Support beams, wall panels, the location of the staircase. Rosalie pointed to a narrow section between two beams. Here, she said quietly. Naomi circled the spot on her legal pad. What happened that night? Rosalie took a moment before answering. I heard him speaking, she said. Late at night, in the basement. To someone I don't think so. It sounded like he was recording something. Naomi wrote another note. And you saw him hide the envelope? Yes. Behind that wall, Rosalie nodded. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Did he know you saw him? I don't think so. Naomi tapped her pen against the desk slowly. What you're describing, she said, could be significant. Rosalie remained silent, especially if it relates to finances, Naomi added. Rosalie's eyes moved toward the folder she had brought. There were transfers happening around the same time, she said. Naomi opened the folder and began flipping on through the bank records Rosalie had organized. Dates, amounts, notes in Rosalie's handwriting. Naomi stopped at one page. These transactions line up with the renovation period. Yes. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. If Randy was moving money while creating hidden storage inside the house, she said slowly, that could explain his urgency to keep the property. Rosalie didn't respond, but the logic felt familiar. Naomi closed the folder. There's only one problem, she said. We can't accuse him of anything yet. Rosalie understood. Evidence had to come first. Naomi stood and walked toward the window overlooking the street. The court allows discovery requests, she said, but physical access to property is more complicated. Rosalie waited. Naomi turned back toward her. If the document is still inside that wall, we need a lawful reason to inspect the house. Rosalie nodded slowly. And if it isn't there anymore, she asked. Naomi met her gaze. Then we rely on the financial records. The room fell quiet for a moment. Finally, Naomi spoke again. I want to contact Marcus Delaney. Rosalie looked up. The contractor, yes. Naomi reached for her phone and searched through her notes. If Marcus worked on that renovation, he'll have records. Construction permits, invoices, delivery receipts. All documents that could confirm the timeline Rosalie had described. 2 days later, Naomi arranged a meeting. Marcus Delaney agreed to stop by the office during his lunch break. He arrived wearing work boots and a faded flannel shirt, looking slightly uncomfortable among the polished furniture of the law office. Naomi shook his hand. Mr. Delaney, thank you for coming. No problem, Marcus said. What's this about? Naomi explained briefly that she represented Rosalie in a divorce proceeding and had questions about the basement renovation. Marcus glanced toward Rosalie with polite curiosity. I remember that job, he said. Nice house. Naomi slid Rosalie's diagram across the desk. Do you remember this wall? Marcus studied it. Yeah, he said after a moment. North side of the basement. Did your crew finish it? Marcus shook his head. No. Randy said he wanted to handle the final panel himself. Did that seem unusual? Marcus shrugged. Homeowners do that sometimes. Naomi nodded. Did you keep renovation records? Marcus pulled out his phone. My office saves everything he said. Invoices, delivery logs. He scrolled for a moment and then showed Naomi several digital receipts. Material deliveries, insulation panels, drywall shipments. The dates matched Rosalie's notes almost exactly. Naomi smiled slightly. That's very helpful. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. Did something go wrong with the renovation, he asked. Naomi shook her head. No, we're just clarifying the timeline. Marcus nodded. Well, Randy was pretty particular about that one wall, he said. He asked us to leave space behind the insulation. Rosalie looked up. Space, Marcus nodded. Yeah, said he might run additional wiring later. Naomi wrote the detail down. Did you ever see him install anything behind the panel? Marcus shook his head. No, that was after we finished. The meeting ended shortly afterward. When Marcus left the office, Naomi closed the door again. Well, she said quietly, that confirms part of your memory. Rosalie sat calmly in her chair. The wall exists, Naomi continued, and Randy insisted on controlling that section. Rosalie nodded. What happens now, she asked. Naomi walked back to her desk. Now we file a motion, she said. For what? For property inspection. Rosalie considered that. And Randy will oppose it, almost certainly. Naomi's expression grew thoughtful. But opposition has consequences. Rosalie tilted her head slightly. How Naomi smiled faintly. If he fights too hard to prevent access to the house, she said the court will start asking why. Rosalie closed her notebook. That was something she had learned in archives as well. When records were hidden too aggressively, investigators eventually became curious about what was being concealed. Outside the office window, traffic moved steadily through downtown Columbus. The divorce process had entered a new phase. Randy Whitaker still believed the house belonged safely within his control. But now, a legal pathway had begun to form. One that could lead directly back to the basement, back to the north wall, and to the envelope he had hidden there years earlier. The envelope he assumed no one else remembered. But Rosalie Wentworth did. And now slowly and carefully, the law was beginning to look for it. Discovery began quietly. No courtroom drama, no raised voices, just documents moving between offices, emails exchanged by attorneys, and deadlines marked on calendars. Yet within that quiet machinery of the legal process, stories often began to reveal themselves. Naomi Caldwell understood this well. 3 days after filing the motion for property inspection, Naomi's office received the first batch of documents from Randy Whitaker's attorney, Douglas Pierce. The envelope arrived mid-morning. Naomi placed the stack of papers on her desk and began reviewing them while the Rosalie sat across from her in silence. Financial disclosures, Naomi said, flipping through the pages. Bank accounts, investment statements, consulting income. Rosalie watched Naomi's expression carefully. Naomi was not a lawyer who reacted quickly. She read slowly, occasionally circling a number with a pencil. After several minutes, she paused. Here, Naomi said, turning a page toward Rosalie. The document showed a list of consulting revenue streams Randy had declared as part of the divorce filing. Several accounts appeared legitimate: client payments, consulting retainers, routine transfers. But one section stood out. Temporary holding accounts. The description was vague. What are those? Rosalie asked. Naomi leaned back slightly. That, she said, is something we'll have to find out. Discovery rules allowed both sides to request additional information when financial disclosures raised questions. Naomi immediately prepared a follow-up request. Any account labeled temporary holding should have documentation, she explained. Transfer records, account ownership explanations. Rosalie nodded. Randy's attorney responded 2 days later. The reply arrived by email rather than physical mail, which Naomi preferred. Digital records made timelines easier to trace. The attachments included several bank statements. Naomi opened the first one, then the second. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. What is it? Rosalie asked. These accounts, Naomi said slowly, are connected to someone named Caleb Monroe. Rosalie recognized the name immediately. Randy mentioned him once, she said. A financial advisor. Naomi opened another file. According to these documents, she said Monroe manages several consulting-related investment accounts for Randy. Rosalie remained quiet. Naomi scrolled further through the statements. That's not unusual, she continued. But the timing of these transfers is interesting. She rotated the laptop toward Rosalie. Highlighted rows showed a series of transactions. Money leaving Randy's consulting accounts, then moving through temporary holding accounts, then disappearing again. What dates are those? Rosalie asked. Naomi checked the column. Late spring, she said. 5 years ago. Rosalie already knew the answer before Naomi finished the sentence. The basement renovation period. Naomi opened Rosalie's folder of personal records and compared the dates. They matched almost perfectly. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Naomi said, "That's not proof of wrongdoing," Rosalie nodded. "But it is a pattern," Naomi continued. Rosalie understood patterns. Naomi continued reviewing the documents. Another email chain appeared among the attachments. This one contained correspondence between Randy and Caleb Monroe. The messages were polite and professional at first, discussions about a consulting income investment strategy, tax positioning. Then Naomi noticed a phrase repeated twice. Temporary shelter. She leaned closer to the screen. "Listen to this," Naomi said. She read a line aloud. "We should move the funds temporarily during the renovation window. That keeps the assets flexible." Rosalie watched Naomi carefully. "Flexible," Rosalie repeated. Naomi scrolled further down. Another message from Randy appeared 2 weeks later. "The renovation gives us enough movement to keep things quiet." Naomi stopped scrolling. Rosalie felt the room grow slightly colder. "That's not illegal language," Naomi said carefully. "But it suggests intent," Rosalie replied. Naomi nodded slowly. "Exactly." She opened a fresh document and began typing notes. Timeline correlations, email excerpts, account transfers. Each element alone might be explained away. Together, they formed something more structured, a financial trail. Rosalie sat quietly while Naomi worked. After several minutes, Naomi spoke again. "There's another issue. What these emails suggest. Randy recorded something." Rosalie looked up. "What do you mean?" Naomi pointed to a sentence in the correspondence. Caleb wrote, "Make sure the recording stays secure." Rosalie's memory moved instantly back to the night 5 years earlier. The quiet voice through the basement ceiling, the pauses between sentences. The envelope. "I heard him recording something," Rosalie said softly. Naomi nodded. That might be the same thing referenced here. She leaned back in her chair. If that recording still exists, it could be important. Rosalie's eyes moved toward the window. "And if it doesn't," Naomi answered calmly, "then we rely on the financial records." At that moment, Naomi's phone rang. The caller ID displayed Douglas Pierce's office. Naomi answered. "Caldwell speaking?" A short conversation followed. Rosalie could only hear Naomi's side. "Yes, I see. Of course." Naomi hung up after a moment. "That was Randy's attorney," she said. "What did he want?" "He's formally opposing the property inspection." Rosalie wasn't surprised. Naomi slid a document across the desk. The objection claimed the inspection request was unnecessary and intrusive. According to Randy's legal team, the property held no relevant evidence. Rosalie studied the page. "Then why fight so hard to prevent it?" she asked. Naomi smiled faintly. "That's the interesting part. In legal disputes, resistance often attracted attention. If Randy had simply allowed the inspection, the issue might have passed quietly. Instead, he had escalated it. Naomi turned back to the computer. "Which means," she said, "the court will now have to decide." Rosalie closed her notebook. The process was unfolding slowly, but every step seemed to move in the same direction. Toward the house, toward the basement, toward the place where Randy had once believed his secrets were safest. Across town, Randy Whitaker sat in his office reviewing emails on his own computer. His attorney had already assured him the inspection request would likely fail. "Basement walls don't contain evidence," Douglas Pierce had said confidently during their call. Randy believed him. After all, 5 years had passed since the renovation. Even if the envelope had remained where he placed it, no one knew about it except him. And Rosalie. But Randy had long ago convinced himself Rosalie hadn't understood what she saw. He believed she had simply noticed construction details the way she noticed everything else quietly without attaching meaning. He underestimated the difference between seeing something and remembering it. Back in Naomi Caldwell's office, Rosalie stood and gathered her folder. Naomi looked up. "We wait for the judge's response," she said. Rosalie nodded. Outside the office building, the afternoon traffic flowed steadily through downtown Columbus. Divorce proceedings were rarely fast, but truth had a way of moving patiently through records. And somewhere behind a wall in the basement of a quiet suburban house, a document waited. A document connected to emails, bank transfers, and a recording someone had once promised would remain secure. Randy Whitaker believed time had buried that record. What he did not realize was that time also had a way of preserving things, especially when someone like Rosalie Wentworth had never stopped paying attention. The court's decision arrived 10 days later. It came as a short, formal notice from the Franklin County Domestic Relations Court, only 2 pages long, written in language that was direct and carefully neutral. Naomi Caldwell read it twice before looking up at Rosalie. "The inspection is approved," she said. Rosalie didn't react immediately. Instead, she simply nodded once. The order granted limited supervised access to the marital residence for the purpose of documenting structural features connected to renovation expenses. The inspection would take place with legal representatives present, along with a licensed property inspector. It was not an accusation. It was not a search warrant. But it was enough. Across town, Randy Whitaker received the same notice through his attorney's office. Douglas Pierce called him within the hour. "They approved it," Pierce said. Randy leaned back in his office chair. "For what exactly a limited inspection?" Pierce replied. "They want to confirm renovation details." Randy's expression hardened slightly. "That's unnecessary." "I argued that," Pierce said calmly. But the judge decided transparency would resolve the issue quickly. Randy stared at the window for several seconds. "Fine," he said finally. "Let them look." Pierce hesitated. "You're certain there's nothing that could complicate things?" Randy's answer came without pause. "Nothing." He ended the call and closed his laptop. For the rest of the afternoon, he worked through emails and client calls as if nothing had changed. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory stirred. A thin envelope, a wall panel, a late-night recording. Randy pushed the thought aside. 5 years had passed. The envelope was still hidden. And even if someone noticed the panel, they would never know where to look. On the morning of the inspection, the sky above Columbus was clear and cold. Rosalie arrived at the house 10 minutes early with Naomi Caldwell. The front yard looked exactly the same as it had for years. Trimmed hedges, the wide porch, the quiet street where neighbors walked dogs in the morning. But today, Rosalie stepped inside not as a homeowner. She entered as a witness. Randy arrived shortly afterward with Douglas Pierce. For a brief moment, the 4 of them stood in the living room together. Randy offered Rosalie a polite nod. "Good morning." Rosalie returned the nod but said nothing. The property inspector arrived next. His name was Liam Porter, a tall man in his 50s, with a clipboard and a professional calm that suggested he had seen many tense domestic situations before. "Morning," he said to the group. Naomi handed him the court order. Liam read it quickly. "All right," he said. "We'll document the basement renovation and structural layout." Randy folded his arms. "Knock yourselves out." They moved toward the basement stairs. Rosalie paused briefly at the top step. The air below smelled faintly of old wood and insulation. Nothing about the room had changed. The same recessed lighting, the same drywall panels, the same quiet space Randy had once used as his private office. Liam began his inspection methodically. He photographed the electrical work first, then the ceiling supports, then the shelving units installed along the far wall. Naomi and Douglas watched silently. Rosalie stood near the staircase observing. Finally, Liam turned toward the north wall. "This section was part of the renovation?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi said. Randy shrugged. Standard drywall. Liam ran his hand lightly along the surface. The panel felt solid, but when he tapped one section with his knuckles, the sound changed slightly. Hollow. He tapped again. The difference was subtle but noticeable. "What's behind this panel?" Liam asked. Randy answered quickly. "Insulation and wiring." Liam knelt beside the wall and examined the screws along the edge. "These aren't standard contractor fasteners," he said. Naomi glanced toward Rosalie. Rosalie remained still. Liam stood again. "May I remove this panel?" he asked. Douglas Pierce hesitated. "The order allows documentation of structural features," he said carefully. Naomi replied calmly, "And a removable panel is certainly a structural feature." Randy shifted his weight. "It's just drywall." Liam looked at him. "Then removing it shouldn't be a problem." The room fell silent. Finally, Randy gave a small shrug. "Go ahead." Liam retrieved a screwdriver from his tool bag and began loosening the screws. Each turn of the tool sounded louder than expected in the quiet basement. Rosalie watched the panel carefully. Second support beam from the corner, exactly where she remembered. Within minutes, the final screw came free. Liam pulled the panel outward. Behind it was a narrow, recessed cavity lined with insulation. For a moment, nothing else appeared visible. Then Liam reached inside. His hand closed around something flat. An envelope. He withdrew it slowly. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but it remained sealed. Liam turned toward the group. "Found this inside." Douglas Pierce frowned. "That's probably construction debris." Naomi extended her hand. "May I see it?" Liam passed the envelope to her. Naomi examined the front. There was no label, no address, just a signature across the sealed flap, Randy Whitaker. The room felt suddenly colder. Randy's posture stiffened. "That's nothing," he said quickly. Naomi looked at him calmly. "Perhaps." She slid the envelope into a clear evidence sleeve from her bag. "We'll review it later." Liam finished documenting the wall cavity while the others remained silent. Rosalie watched the process quietly. 5 years earlier, she had stood on the staircase and seen Randy hide the envelope. Now she watched as the same envelope emerged again into the light. The moment carried no drama, no raised voices, just the quiet movement of a record returning to visibility. When the inspection ended, Liam gathered his equipment. "That concludes the structural documentation," he said. Naomi thanked him. Douglas Pierce looked unsettled. Randy walked toward the basement stairs without speaking. Upstairs, the group paused briefly near the front door. Naomi turned to Rosalie. "We'll review the contents carefully before submitting anything," she said. Rosalie nodded. Randy opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit his face sharply. For the first time since the divorce began, a small crack had appeared in the structure he believed he controlled. Back inside, Naomi held the evidence sleeve carefully. "What matters now," she said quietly, "is what's inside this envelope." Rosalie looked toward the basement staircase one last time. 5 years earlier, the document had disappeared behind a wall. Now it had returned. And soon the record it contained would begin to speak. The envelope remained sealed when Naomi Caldwell placed it on her desk that afternoon. She did not open it immediately. Legal evidence Naomi had learned over many years of practice carried weight, not just because of what it contained, but because of how it was handled. Timing mattered. Documentation mattered. Context mattered. Rosalie sat quietly across from the desk, watching Naomi prepare the process. First, Naomi photographed the envelope from several angles. Front, back, the sealed flap. And most importantly, the signature written across the fold in dark ink. Randy Whitaker. The handwriting was unmistakably his smooth, deliberate, confident. The kind of signature people practice until it looks certain. Naomi slid the envelope into a labeled evidence sleeve. "Before we open it," she said calmly, "I want a record of exactly how it was found." Rosalie nodded. The law office had a small conference room used for depositions. Naomi asked one of her assistants to bring in a video camera used for documenting evidence reviews. Within minutes, the room was ready. A camera sat on a tripod aimed at the center of the conference table. Naomi placed the envelope beneath the lens. "This is standard procedure," she explained to Rosalie. "Chain of custody." Rosalie understood the concept immediately. Archives used similar procedures when handling rare documents. Naomi began recording. "Today's date," she said clearly, "evidence review related to the dissolution case of Whitaker versus Whitaker." She held up the envelope. This document was recovered during a court-approved inspection of the marital residence basement wall. Rosalie watched as Naomi carefully sliced the sealed flap open. Inside was a folded document and a small USB flash drive. Naomi unfolded the paper first. The room remained silent as she read. Then she placed the document flat on the table so the camera could capture it. Rosalie leaned forward slightly. The paper contained several typed paragraphs. At the bottom was a handwritten signature, Randy Whitaker. The text itself was not long, but it was precise. It described a series of financial transfers Randy had arranged through consulting accounts and temporary holding structures. The language suggested a deliberate attempt to move funds away from accounts that might appear in official disclosures. A portion of the document read, "The funds are temporarily relocated during the renovation window. Once the asset division period has passed, they can be reintegrated without drawing unnecessary scrutiny." Rosalie felt a quiet stillness settle in the room. Naomi continued reading. Another line stood out. "In the unlikely event that questions arise, the records will reflect construction expenditures and consulting allocations." Naomi looked up slowly. "This," she said, "is essentially a written strategy." Rosalie's voice remained soft. "For hiding assets?" Naomi nodded. "Yes." She tapped the USB drive beside the document. "And this may be the recording referenced in the emails." Naomi connected the drive to her laptop. A single file appeared on the screen. audio_statement_2019.mp3. Naomi clicked play. Randy's voice filled the quiet conference room. The recording quality was clear enough to remove any doubt about the speaker. "Just documenting this, so I remember the structure later," Randy's voice said casually. There was the sound of a chair moving in the background. "The renovation period is perfect timing. Construction expenses always move money around. No one questions it." A short pause. "The consulting accounts stay separate. Caleb handles the holding transfers. Once everything settles, the funds come back clean." Another pause. Then Randy laughed quietly. "Rosalie doesn't deal with this stuff anyway." The audio continued for several minutes, outlining the same financial structure described in the written document. When the recording ended, Naomi stopped the playback. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Naomi said, "Well." Rosalie's expression remained calm. Naomi leaned back in her chair. "This is not subtle." "No," Rosalie said. "It shows intent," Naomi continued. "Not just financial movement, but planning." Rosalie looked down at the document again. For years, the envelope had existed only as a memory behind a wall. Now the contents lay plainly on a conference table. Naomi began organizing the materials into separate folders. "One more thing," she said. "What this recording contains something very important." Rosalie waited. "Randy references a third party, Caleb Monroe." Rosalie nodded. Naomi opened the email records again on her laptop. "The emails we received during discovery mention a recording," she said. Now we know what that meant. Rosalie understood immediately. The evidence was beginning to connect. Emails, bank transfers, a signed document, and now a recording explaining the entire structure. Naomi closed the laptop. Randy assumed the recording was safe behind that wall. Rosalie's voice remained steady. He forgot the house might be inspected. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. Yes. Later that evening, Naomi called Douglas Pierce. She kept the conversation brief. "We recovered a document and audio recording from the basement wall," Naomi said. Pierce's voice tightened slightly. "What kind of document? One signed by your client?" There was a long pause. I'll need to review it, Pierce said. Of course, Naomi replied. We'll provide copies through formal disclosure. Pierce ended the call shortly afterward. Across town, Randy Whitaker sat alone in his home office when his phone rang. He answered without looking at the caller ID. Yes, Randy Douglas. Pierce said quietly. We need to talk. Something in his attorney's tone made Randy sit up straighter. What happened? They found something during the inspection. Randy's chest tightened. What Pierce spoke carefully. An envelope hidden behind the basement wall. For a moment, Randy said nothing. His mind moved quickly through memories he had carefully buried. The recording, the document, the envelope he had sealed himself. That's impossible, he said finally. It was signed, Pierce continued, with your name. Randy stood abruptly from his chair. What exactly did they find? A written statement and an audio recording? The room felt suddenly smaller. Randy pressed his hand against the desk. That recording was private, he said. Pierce's voice remained calm. It was also hidden inside the marital property. Randy closed his eyes briefly. 5 years earlier, he had believed the basement wall was the safest place he could store something sensitive. He had trusted the house, trusted the renovation, trusted the assumption that no one else had paid attention. But Rosalie had. And now, the envelope had returned. Back in Naomi Caldwell's office, Rosalie stood near the window while Naomi organized the evidence files. What happens now? Rosalie asked. Naomi looked up. Now, she said, the record begins to speak in court. Rosalie nodded quietly. For years, she had preserved documents in archives so historians could understand the past. Now, a document preserved behind a wall was about to reveal the truth about her marriage. Not through anger, not through accusation, but through Randy Whitaker's own words. The discovery of the envelope changed the tone of the divorce almost immediately. Not publicly, not yet. But inside the quiet corridors of legal procedure, the balance had shifted. Naomi Caldwell spent the next several days preparing the evidence with careful precision. The signed document, the audio recording, and the basement inspection report were all cataloged and cross-referenced. Each item had to be introduced properly within the legal structure of the case. Evidence, Naomi often said, was not powerful simply because it existed. It was powerful because it could be connected. Rosalie sat across from Naomi's desk while the documents were arranged into a new timeline. On the wall behind Naomi hung a large whiteboard normally used for trial preparation. Now it held a series of dates written in careful marker. 2019. Basement renovation begins 2019. Financial transfers through temporary accounts. 2019. Audio recording. Created 2024. Divorce filing. 2024. Envelope recovered. Naomi tapped the board lightly with the marker. The confession gives us intent, she said. Rosalie nodded, but intent alone doesn't always win a case. Rosalie looked toward the folders spread across the desk. What else do we need? Financial confirmation, Naomi replied. She opened a new set of documents. Bank records. Naomi had already begun issuing subpoenas to several financial institutions connected to Randy Whitaker's consulting accounts. The process took time, but once authorized by the court, banks were required to provide transaction histories. 3 days later, the first records arrived. Naomi reviewed them late into the evening while Rosalie waited nearby. Line after line of numbers filled the screen. Transfers, withdrawals, account movements. At first glance, the activity looked like ordinary consulting income money moving between business accounts. But Naomi was not looking at the transactions individually. She was studying the pattern. Here, she said suddenly. Rosalie leaned forward. Naomi highlighted a series of transfers. These funds leave Randy's consulting account. She pointed to the next line. Then they move through Caleb Monroe's investment management account. Rosalie followed the trail, and then Naomi scrolled further. They disappear. Rosalie frowned slightly. What do you mean, disappear? They leave the reporting accounts entirely. Naomi opened another document. A second bank had responded to the subpoena. New statements appeared. Rosalie watched as Naomi cross-referenced the account numbers. There it is, Naomi said quietly. A hidden account. The name on the account was not Randy Whitaker. It belonged to a small consulting company, Northbridge Advisory Group. Rosalie studied the page. I've never heard of that company. Naomi nodded. That's the point. She began tracing the money again. Randy's consulting income moved into temporary accounts. Those funds were then transferred to Northbridge Advisory Group. From there, they remained untouched for months, sometimes longer. Naomi leaned back slowly. This, she said, is the rest of the story. Rosalie remained silent. The numbers were not dramatic. They did not appear as one enormous transfer. Instead, they accumulated gradually. $30,000, $50,000, sometimes smaller amounts. But over the course of several years, the total grew. Naomi wrote a number at the bottom of the page. Rosalie read it. Nearly $480,000. The room fell quiet. That money never appeared in Randy's divorce disclosures, Naomi said. Rosalie nodded slowly. So the confession wasn't just theory. No. Naomi tapped the audio transcript lying beside the bank records. In the recording, he said the funds would be reintegrated later. Rosalie looked at the timeline again. He never got the chance. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. Exactly. The next morning, Naomi scheduled a follow-up meeting with the bank investigator who had assisted with the subpoena responses. His name was Evan Calloway, a financial compliance analyst who frequently worked with legal cases involving complex transactions. Evan arrived carrying a laptop and a stack of printed statements. I reviewed the transfers you flagged, he said as he sat down. Naomi nodded. What's your impression? Evan opened the laptop and projected a visual chart onto the conference room screen. Lines representing money flows stretched across the display. It's layered movement, Evan explained, meaning funds are routed through multiple accounts to make the origin harder to track. Rosalie watched the chart carefully. Evan pointed to the first section. Here's Randy's consulting account. Then he pointed to the next stage. Then the funds move into Monroe's managed accounts. Another arrow followed. Then to Northbridge Advisory. Rosalie asked quietly, Is that illegal? Evan considered the question. Not by itself, he said. But when someone fails to disclose those accounts during divorce proceedings? He didn't finish the sentence. Naomi completed it for him. It becomes financial deception. Evan nodded. Exactly. Rosalie felt the pattern solidify. For years, Randy had moved money quietly through layers of accounts while maintaining the appearance of normal consulting activity. The basement recording had described the strategy. The bank records now confirmed it. Naomi turned to Evan. Can you prepare a formal report summarizing this structure? Of course. Evan began typing notes immediately. Later that afternoon, Naomi sent the completed financial analysis to Douglas Pierce's office through formal discovery disclosure. Pierce called within an hour. Naomi, he said carefully, these allegations are serious. They're not allegations, Naomi replied. They're documented transfers. Pierce sighed quietly. I'll review the records with my client. You should, Naomi said. Across the city, Randy Whitaker sat at his dining table staring at the printed bank statements Douglas Pierce had delivered. Page after page of transactions, highlighted lines, notes from financial analysts. Randy's voice sounded strained when he spoke. They're misinterpreting the structure. Pierce looked at him evenly. Randy, the issue isn't the structure. What do you mean the issue is disclosure? Pierce tapped the divorce financial affidavit lying on the table. You signed this document stating all financial assets were listed. Randy ran a hand through his hair. The funds were temporary. Pierce's voice remained calm. That's not what matters anymore. Randy looked at the chart again. The arrows tracing the movement of money now felt like a map of his own decisions. The envelope behind the wall, the recording, the accounts he believed no one would find. Everything had begun to connect. Back in Naomi Caldwell's office, Rosalie stood near the whiteboard, studying the timeline. Naomi added one more note beneath the others. 2024. Undisclosed assets identified. Rosalie looked at the board quietly. For years, she had preserved historical records so others could understand hidden truths about the past. Now the records of her own marriage were forming the same kind of narrative. Emails, bank transfers, a confession, each piece reinforcing the others. Naomi set down the marker. "The hearing is in 2 weeks," she said. Rosalie nodded. By then, the financial trail would be fully documented, and when the court reviewed the case, Randy Whitaker's own records would begin telling a story he could no longer control. The morning of the hearing arrived with the quiet certainty of something long expected. For weeks, the divorce proceedings had unfolded through paperwork, emails, and private meetings between attorneys. But courtrooms changed the rhythm of disputes. What had once been discussed quietly in offices now moved into a space where records were spoken aloud. Rosalie Wentworth arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse just before 9. The building was already busy. Lawyers moved quickly through the marble corridors, carrying folders and legal pads. Couples waiting for their hearings sat on wooden benches along the hallway, speaking in low voices or staring silently at the floor. Rosalie stood beside Naomi Caldwell near the courtroom doors. She wore a dark coat and held the same small notebook she had carried throughout the process, though today she did not open it. Naomi glanced toward her. "Nervous?" she asked gently. Rosalie considered the question. "No," she said. And it was true. The weeks leading to this morning had been filled with preparation, documentation, and careful review. By now the records had been organized so thoroughly that Rosalie no longer felt uncertainty. The story was already written. The court would simply read it. Across the hallway, Randy Whitaker entered the building with his attorney Douglas Pierce. Randy wore the same navy suit he had chosen for the mediation session. His posture remained confident, his expression calm. If he felt pressure, he did not show it openly. He spotted Rosalie near the courtroom entrance. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Randy nodded politely. Rosalie returned the gesture with the same quiet composure. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors shortly afterward. "Case Whitaker versus Whitaker," he announced. The room inside was modest but formal. A raised bench at the front held the judge's seat. Rows of wooden benches filled the center of the room, with 2 tables positioned near the front for attorneys. Judge Margaret Holloway entered a few minutes later. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the steady presence of someone who had presided over hundreds of cases. Everyone stood. The judge took her seat. "Please be seated." The room settled into silence. Judge Holloway reviewed the file briefly before speaking. "This hearing concerns financial disclosures and property division related to the dissolution of marriage between Randy Whitaker and Rosalie Wentworth Whitaker." Her voice was calm and direct. "I understand there have been developments involving newly discovered documentation." Naomi Caldwell stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Douglas Pierce remained seated but attentive. Judge Holloway nodded. "Before we begin, I want to remind both parties that the court expects clear, factual presentations. Emotional arguments are not necessary." She glanced toward the attorneys. "Proceed." Douglas Pierce rose first. "Your Honor, he said my client maintains that the marital residence should remain under his ownership. Mr. Whitaker has been responsible for the financial maintenance of the property throughout the marriage." Judge Holloway listened without interruption. Pierce continued. "The property renovations and mortgage obligations have primarily been managed by Mr. Whitaker. For that reason, we believe awarding him the residence remains the most practical outcome." The judge made a brief note on her file. "Thank you." She turned toward Naomi. "Miss Caldwell." Naomi stood calmly. Your Honor, while Mr. Whitaker's counsel describes the house as a straightforward financial matter, recent evidence suggests the property is directly connected to undisclosed financial activity. Randy's jaw tightened slightly. Naomi continued. The evidence we will present today includes bank records, email correspondence, and a document recovered during a court-approved property inspection. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow slightly. Recovered from the residence? Yes, Your Honor. Naomi stepped toward the evidence table and placed a folder before the judge. This document was found inside the basement wall of the marital residence. Randy shifted in his chair. Judge Holloway opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the signed statement recovered from the envelope. She read the first paragraph silently, then the second. The courtroom remained completely still. Finally, the judge looked up. This document bears Mr. Whitaker's signature. Naomi nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Douglas Pierce stood. Your Honor, we have not yet fully evaluated the authenticity of Judge Holloway raised a hand. Mr. Pierce, the court will allow the document to be introduced provisionally while its context is examined. Pierce sat back down. Naomi continued. The document describes a financial structure involving temporary relocation of funds during the basement renovation period. Judge Holloway looked toward Randy. Mr. Whitaker, were you aware this document existed? Randy cleared his throat. I may have written notes during that time, he said carefully. Notes about what the judge asked. Consulting finances. Naomi stepped forward again. Your Honor, the written statement is accompanied by an audio recording made by Mr. Whitaker. Judge Holloway's attention sharpened. Recording, yes. Naomi placed a small device on the evidence table. With the court's permission, we would like to play a brief excerpt. Judge Holloway nodded. Proceed. The courtroom fell silent as the audio began. Randy Whitaker's voice filled the room. The renovation window keeps the transfers quiet. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Construction expenses move money around. Rosalie sat still, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The recording continued. Rosalie doesn't deal with this stuff anyway. Naomi stopped the playback. Judge Holloway looked toward Randy. Mr. Whitaker, she said slowly, is that your voice? Randy hesitated. Then he nodded. Yes. The judge turned to Douglas Pierce. Mr. Pierce, your client appears to have documented a financial structure involving undisclosed funds. Pierce rose again. Your Honor, the recording was informal commentary. It does not necessarily represent actual financial actions. Naomi spoke calmly. Your Honor, the financial actions themselves are documented in the bank records. She placed another folder on the bench. These records show nearly $500,000 moving through temporary accounts, not disclosed in Mr. Whitaker's financial affidavit. Judge Holloway opened the folder. She studied the chart prepared by the financial analyst. The arrows tracing the movement of money were simple but unmistakable. After several moments, she looked up again. Mr. Whitaker, she said, did you disclose these accounts in your divorce filings? Randy's voice was quieter now. No. The words settled heavily in the room. Judge Holloway closed the file. Very well, she said. The courtroom remained silent. Rosalie did not look at Randy. She did not smile or react. The evidence was speaking now, and the story Randy Whitaker believed he controlled was unfolding through his own words. After Randy Whitaker admitted that the accounts had not been disclosed, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. No one raised their voice. No one reacted dramatically. But everyone present understood that something significant had shifted. Judge Margaret Holloway looked down at the document spread across her bench. The financial chart prepared by the analyst sat beside the signed statement recovered from the basement wall. The audio transcript lay open nearby. 3 different forms of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. The judge adjusted her glasses and spoke calmly. Miss Caldwell, she said, please walk the court through the financial timeline. Naomi Caldwell stood again. Yes, Your Honor. She moved to the presentation table and turned slightly toward the judge. For clarity, she said, we will review the records chronologically. Naomi placed the first document on the evidence screen. A simple bank statement. This account belongs to Mr. Whitaker's consulting business, she explained. Funds entered the account through legitimate client payments. Judge Holloway nodded. That appears normal. Naomi changed the display. The next step shows the funds being transferred into accounts managed by a financial advisor, Mr. Caleb Monroe. She paused. These transfers occurred during the same period as the basement renovation. The judge glanced at the timeline. 2019, she said. Yes, Your Honor, Naomi continued. From there, the funds were moved into a separate entity called Northbridge Advisory Group. Another document appeared. The account name was clearly visible. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. Was this account disclosed in Mr. Whitaker's financial affidavit? No, Your Honor. Douglas Pierce rose from his chair. Your Honor, the Northbridge account was associated with consulting activities. My client believed it did not fall under marital assets. Naomi responded immediately. The funds originated from accounts used during the marriage. Judge Holloway raised a hand. Mr. Pierce, the court will determine the relevance. Pierce sat down again. Naomi continued presenting the documents. Line after line of transfers appeared on the screen. The amounts varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Consulting income, temporary accounts. Then Northbridge Advisory. Finally, Naomi displayed the final calculation prepared by the financial analyst. The total appeared in large numbers at the bottom of the chart. $482,600. The judge read the figure carefully. That amount was never disclosed during the divorce filings. No, Your Honor, Naomi said. Judge Holloway looked toward Randy Whitaker again. Randy sat very still. Mr. Whitaker, she said, do you dispute these bank records? Randy hesitated. No. The judge nodded once. Very well. Naomi moved to the next piece of evidence. The financial movement alone might suggest oversight, she said calmly. However, the written statement recovered from the basement wall provides context. She placed the document on the screen. The courtroom could now read the lines that described moving funds during the renovation period. Judge Holloway read silently. Then she turned toward Randy. This document outlines a strategy for relocating funds temporarily to avoid scrutiny. Randy said nothing. Naomi spoke again. The audio recording confirms the same intent. She played a short portion of the recording once more. The renovation window keeps the transfers quiet. The sound of Randy's own voice seemed heavier in the courtroom this time. Judge Holloway turned the recording off. For several seconds, she simply studied the evidence. Then she addressed Randy directly. Mr. Whitaker, the court requires full financial disclosure during divorce proceedings. Failure to disclose assets can have serious legal consequences. Randy's attorney stood again. Your Honor, my client did not intend to deceive the court. Judge Holloway looked at him evenly. The recording suggests otherwise. Pierce opened his mouth to respond, but the judge continued. The statement refers specifically to avoiding scrutiny. Pierce closed the file slowly. Naomi returned to her seat. The evidence had now been fully presented. Emails, bank records, the signed confession, and the recording. Judge Holloway rested her hands on the bench. Mr. Whitaker, she said you requested ownership of the marital residence on the grounds that you maintain the financial responsibilities of the property. Rand nodded faintly. Yes. But the court now sees that the residence also served as the location where financial documentation was concealed. The room remained silent. Rosalie sat quietly beside Naomi. She had not spoken once during the hearing. She did not look toward Randy. Her attention remained on the judge. Judge Holloway continued. Mr. Whitaker, the court is particularly concerned that the document describing this financial structure was hidden within the property you now request to keep. Randy's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. It wasn't meant to be permanent, he said quietly. The judge tilted her head. Yet it remained hidden for 5 years. Randy had no answer. Judge Holloway looked back at the documents again. The court reporter continued typing steadily. Finally, the judge closed the folder. This matter will influence the court's evaluation of both credibility and asset division. Douglas Pierce spoke carefully. Your Honor, we would request an opportunity to review the financial interpretation further. You will have that opportunity, Judge Holloway replied. She looked toward both attorneys. The court will recess briefly before issuing its decision regarding the property and financial disclosures. The bailiff announced the recess. Everyone stood as the judge left the bench. The courtroom gradually filled with quiet movement as people stepped into the hallway. Randy remained seated for several seconds after the others rose. Douglas Pierce leaned toward him. "This is serious," the attorney said quietly. Randy stared at the table. "I know." Across the room, Rosalie stood beside Naomi Caldwell. Naomi spoke softly. "You handled that well." Rosalie gave a small nod. She had not needed to say anything. The evidence had spoken clearly enough. Outside the courtroom windows, the afternoon light shifted across the city. In a few minutes, the judge would return. And when she did, the records that Randy Whitaker had once hidden behind a basement wall would determine the outcome of the house he had demanded so confidently. The courtroom remained quiet during the recess. People spoke in low voices in the hallway outside, but inside the room itself, very little movement occurred. Randy Whitaker stayed seated at the defense table, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. His attorney, Douglas Pierce, stood beside him, reviewing notes with a tense expression that was far less confident than it had been earlier in the morning. Across the room, Rosalie Wentworth stood beside Naomi Caldwell, near one of the tall windows that looked out toward the street below. Neither woman spoke much. There was no need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed into the record. After several minutes, the courtroom door opened again. The bailiff stepped inside and called for everyone to return to their seats. All rise. Judge Margaret Holloway entered the room once more. The sound of chairs sliding against the wooden floor echoed softly as everyone stood. The judge took her seat and the room settled into silence. "Please be seated." Judge Holloway opened the file in front of her. For several seconds, she reviewed the documents again, bank statements, transcripts, the signed document recovered from the basement wall. Then she looked up. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented this morning," she said. Her voice was calm but firm. "The matter before the court concerns two primary issues, financial disclosure and the division of marital property, including the marital residence." She paused briefly before continuing. "Full financial transparency is a fundamental requirement during divorce proceedings. The court relies on accurate disclosures to ensure equitable distribution of assets." Judge Holloway lifted one of the documents slightly. "In this case, the court has been presented with bank records demonstrating that nearly $500,000 moved through accounts not disclosed in Mr. Whitaker's financial affidavit." Randy's gaze remained fixed on the table. The judge continued. "These transfers were confirmed by independent financial analysis and were further referenced in a written document bearing Mr. Whitaker's signature." She placed the document back down. The court also heard an audio recording in which Mr. Whitaker described a strategy for relocating funds during a renovation period. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Holloway turned her attention directly toward Randy. "Mr. Whitaker, the court must consider both the financial evidence and the credibility of the parties involved." Randy looked up slowly. The judge's voice remained measured. "The undisclosed accounts raise serious concerns regarding the accuracy of your financial disclosures." Douglas Pierce rose carefully from his seat. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges the omission, but did not intend to mislead the court." Judge Holloway nodded slightly. "The court has taken that statement into consideration." She closed the file. However, intent does not change the fact that the disclosures were incomplete. Pierce sat down again. Judge Holloway shifted her focus to the issue Randy had raised repeatedly since the beginning of the divorce: the marital residence. She folded her hands. Mr. Whitaker requested that the home remain under his ownership, citing his management of financial responsibilities during the marriage. The judge paused. However, the evidence presented shows that the property also served as the location where undisclosed financial documentation was hidden. Randy's shoulders lowered slightly. Judge Holloway continued. The court cannot ignore the significance of that fact. She turned a page in the file. In determining property division, the court must consider fairness, transparency, and the conduct of both parties. Her eyes moved briefly toward Rosalie. Mrs. Wentworth has provided consistent financial records and cooperated fully with the discovery process. Rosalie remained still. The judge looked back toward Randy. In contrast, Mr. Whitaker failed to disclose significant financial assets and attempted to conceal documentation related to those assets within the marital property. Another quiet pause settled across the courtroom. Then Judge Holloway spoke the decision. The court finds that the marital residence cannot reasonably be awarded solely to Mr. Whitaker under these circumstances. Douglas Pierce lowered his eyes toward his notes. Judge Holloway continued. Given the undisclosed assets identified during the proceedings, the court will order a recalculation of the marital asset distribution. She explained the ruling step by step. The funds that had been hidden through the Northbridge advisory account would be included in the marital estate. Financial penalties related to the non-disclosure would also be considered during final settlement calculations. Finally, the judge addressed the House directly. The marital residence will remain subject to equitable division. This may include sale of the property or allocation based on the corrected financial balance between the parties. Randy said nothing. Judge Holloway closed the file completely. The court will issue the full written order within the next several days. She looked at both attorneys. Until that time, both parties are instructed to maintain transparency in all remaining financial matters. The judge paused once more. This hearing is concluded. The bailiff stepped forward. All rise. Everyone stood again as Judge Holloway exited the courtroom. For several seconds after the judge left the room, remained still. Then the quiet murmur of movement returned. Douglas Pierce gathered his files slowly. Randy remained seated. His confident posture from earlier that morning had disappeared. Across the room, Rosalie stood beside Naomi Caldwell. Naomi closed her folder. That went exactly the way the evidence suggested, she said softly. Rosalie nodded. There was no visible triumph in her expression. No relief either. Only the quiet steadiness she had carried through the entire process. Naomi looked toward Randy briefly. He built his argument around the house, she said. But the house held the one thing he forgot about. Rosalie understood. The basement wall, the envelope, the recording. All of it had waited quietly for years. And when the moment came, it had spoken without anger, without accusation, simply through the record. Naomi touched Rosalie's arm gently. Let's go. Rosalie picked up her coat and walked toward the courtroom doors. Randy Whitaker remained seated at the table for a few seconds longer. Then he finally stood and gathered his papers. The house he had demanded so confidently was no longer something he could control, because the truth he had hidden beneath it had changed everything. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon. Divorce hearings rarely ended with dramatic moments. There were no speeches, no applause, no clear emotional release. People gathered their papers, spoke briefly with their attorneys, and stepped back into the ordinary movement of the city. Rosalie Wentworth walked down the courthouse steps beside Naomi Caldwell. The air outside felt colder than it had that morning, though the sky remained clear. Cars moved steadily through the intersection at the end of the street. A man waited at the crosswalk with a coffee cup in his hand, unaware that inside the courthouse, a marriage had just been formally dismantled through records and testimony. Naomi paused near the sidewalk. "The written order will arrive within a few days?" she said. Rosalie nodded. "I understand." Naomi studied her for a moment. "Most people feel something different at this point," she said. Rosalie looked toward the street. What do they usually feel? Relief? Anger? Sometimes satisfaction? Rosalie considered the words. "I don't feel any of those," she said quietly. Naomi smiled faintly. That might be a good thing. They said goodbye shortly afterward. Naomi returned toward her office building while Rosalie walked toward the parking lot alone. For a long moment, she stood beside her car without opening the door. 9 years of marriage had ended inside a quiet courtroom. And yet the moment felt less like an ending and more like the closing of a long record. 2 days later, Rosalie returned to the house. The legal process had not yet finalized the property division, but both attorneys had agreed she could visit the home briefly to collect personal belongings. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A neighbor across the street trimmed a hedge beside his driveway. Nothing about the street suggested the private history that had unfolded inside one of its houses. Rosalie unlocked the front door. The house felt strangely quiet. Not empty exactly, but paused. She walked slowly through the living room, past the dining table where she had once sorted bank statements late at night. The kitchen counters were clean. The same morning light filtered through the windows. Everything appeared ordinary. But Rosalie understood something that visitors would never see. Houses kept records. Every room held memories of conversations, decisions, and small details that shaped the lives of the people inside. She walked toward the basement stairs. For a moment she rested her hand on the railing. Then she descended. The basement looked unchanged since the inspection. The recessed lighting cast a soft glow across the walls Randy had insisted on renovating years earlier. The desk he once used for late-night calls still stood near the far corner. Rosalie crossed the room slowly. The north wall stood exactly where she remembered it. Second support beam from the corner. The section where the panel had been removed during the inspection was still slightly visible. The screws had been replaced, but the surface no longer looked perfectly seamless. Rosalie stood there for a while. 5 years earlier, she had watched Randy hide an envelope behind that wall. At the time, she hadn't known exactly what the document contained. She had only recognized that something about the moment mattered. Now she knew the full story. The envelope had held a confession, not one written for the court or for lawyers, a confession Randy had recorded for himself, for the version of the future he believed he controlled. Rosalie ran her hand lightly across the wall. There was no anger in the gesture, only recognition. The basement had been the place where Randy believed his plans were safest, but the same place had preserved the truth. She turned and walked back upstairs. In the bedroom, she opened a small storage box and removed a few personal items, photographs, several notebooks, a framed picture from early in the marriage when the house had still been under renovation. Rosalie placed them carefully into a bag. When she finished packing, she carried the bag downstairs and stepped outside. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the street. She locked the door behind her and stood on the porch for a moment. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. But Rosalie understood something that no one passing by could see. The house had done its job. It had kept the record safe until the moment the truth needed to be heard. Later that evening, Rosalie met Naomi Caldwell for coffee near the university campus. The cafe was quiet, filled mostly with students studying at small tables. Naomi placed the court documents on the table between them. "The final order should arrive tomorrow," she said. Rosalie nodded. Naomi studied her for a moment. "You never tried to confront him directly," Naomi said. Rosalie stirred her coffee slowly. "Wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe not." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "But most people would have tried." Rosalie thought about the question. "Records are patient," she said after a moment. Naomi smiled. "That might be the most archivist answer I've ever heard." Rosalie allowed herself the smallest smile in return. The truth had never required raised voices or arguments. It had only required time. When they left the cafe later that evening, the city streets were already growing quiet. Rosalie walked alone toward her apartment building several blocks away. The bag containing her notebooks rested lightly in her hand. Behind her, somewhere across the city, the house on the quiet suburban street still stood. The basement walls remained intact. But the secret that had once been hidden there was no longer part of the structure. It had moved into the record. And the record, once spoken, never needed to raise its voice again. Rosalie continued walking through the evening air, leaving the past behind with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the entire case. The story of Rosalie Wentworth and Randy Whittaker does not end with celebration. There are no dramatic victories in courtrooms like the ones we see in movies. Real justice usually arrives quietly through document signatures and the steady patience of people who refuse to abandon the truth. Rosalie never raised her voice during the process. She never tried to humiliate the man who had once been her husband. She simply observed, documented, and waited for the record to speak. And when the moment came, it did. Sometimes the loudest people believe they control the story simply because they speak first. But history, law, and truth often work differently. They wait, they gather evidence, and eventually they reveal what was always there. Rosalie didn't leave the courthouse with triumph. She left with something quieter and far more enduring, her dignity intact, her name clear, and her future no longer tied to someone else's secrets. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Stories like this travel across cities, countries, and time zones, and it's always fascinating to see where people are listening. And if you believe that patience, integrity, and truth still matter even when they take time to surface, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many stories like this one. Stories where the strongest response is not revenge, but quiet strength. Stories where the record eventually tells the truth. And sometimes, all it takes is one forgotten envelope behind a basement wall.